Hello and welcome back. Today, I'm very pleased to bring to you the conversation with Professor Felix Oberholzer-Gee. He teaches strategy at the Harvard Business School. He serves as the faculty chair of the Senior Executive Leadership Program for China and the Driving Digital Strategy Program. He's also the author of the book, Better, Simpler Strategy, a value-based guide to exceptional performance. He's also the co-host of a very popular Harvard Business Review podcast called After Hours, which is a lot of fun, and I will highly recommend you to check it out. And with that, let's get into the discussion. Felix, it's great to have you with us today. Thank you for joining.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Rachit.
Yeah, I want to understand from you in your own words, what is value-based strategy?
So, of course, as with all strategy, we want our companies to be successful, financially successful, and creating value for customers, employees, or suppliers is the best way to think about where success comes from. If you compare companies that do really well with companies that maybe are average or companies that don't do so well, and you ask, what's the difference? The difference always boils down to something actually quite simple. The companies that don't do so well, they don't create as much value. And so thinking about how much value you create for others is really the precondition to being successful yourself. It's almost a little bit contradictory. If you want to be very selfish, only think about yourself, the best way to do this is to think about others first. Think about your customers, think about your employees, think about suppliers.
Yeah, in the book, you talk massively about the value stick and what is willingness to pay and willingness to sell. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'll make sure that it's somewhere on the screen in the edit so that people also have a visual cue to what you're speaking.
Okay. So then, of course, if the main task is to create value, the question is, how do you measure value? How do you know whether you create value? And so we measure value by comparing the willingness to pay of customers. That is the most a customer would ever pay. Charge her $1 more and she's better off not buying, with the willingness to sell of employees and suppliers. Now, willingness to sell is not quite as intuitive as willingness to pay, but here's an example, I think, that will make it clear what it is. Think of a person, a friend perhaps, who works at some other company, not your organization. And now you're trying to convince her to move to your company. You're writing the offer letter, and you're thinking about, what salary should I offer? The minimum salary that this person would accept and move, that's her willingness to sell. So it reflects many factors. It has to do with her preferences. It has to do with the type of job that you have. If the job is like super, super interesting, like the best job she could ever think of, then of course, willingness to sell will go down. You create more value because that minimum compensation is not quite as high. If the job is, say, physically dangerous, then of course you want more compensation, and so willingness to sell goes up. Now, the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to sell, that's the total value that your company creates. And it gets split in three ways. Some of it goes to customers, some of it goes to employees and suppliers, and some of it you get to keep.
Yeah. That's. I think that was one of my biggest takeaways from the book. Honestly, when I think of value-based strategy, it doesn't come across as rocket science, right?
But it's not. Yes.
But why do you?
That's exactly right. I think one of the reasons why I call the book Better, Simpler Strategy, because I see it so often that people think strategy is super complicated. And you have to be very senior. In fact, if you're early in your career, you can't really be a serious strategic thinker. And it's completely wrong. It's not true. Strategy is very simple. There's only two things: increases in willingness to pay or decreases in willingness to sell. Done. There's nothing else.
Yeah.
And these two ideas are really important when you think about the potential for a company to be financially successful. Everything that you think about doing needs to be filtered through these two very simple questions. Does it increase willingness to pay? Does it decrease willingness to sell? If neither one of those is true, move on. It's a waste of time. It's not going to make a difference.
Yeah. To build up on what you just said, how do you think people or companies can make a more smoother switch from being a very sales-driven organizations to maybe becoming more value-driven organizations? Because it seems like in the longer term, that pays off much better, right? And I want you to talk specifically in the context of companies going through digital transformation.
So maybe I'll go back to a comment that you made a little earlier about, what companies do today often doesn't seem that effective. So many companies have difficulty earning their cost of capital, but it comes from a good place, right? Because companies face many challenges. You see, oh, the world is globalizing, so you probably need a global strategy. There's digital technology, so you probably need a digital strategy. It's hard to get the right people, so you need a talent strategy, and so on and so on. So it's not we often have very many layers of strategy and they're not very well connected to one another, but the impetus, the idea comes from a good place. It's just that we're not executing as effectively as we can. And so to your question about sales-driven versus value-driven organizations, in sales-driven organizations, you're basically thinking about how can I sell more of what I have today? Or maybe you're thinking about the next round of products that you're going to develop. And so the task is really to convince the customer that what you have is what he or she should buy. Value-driven strategy is very different in that you recognize maybe your product is not the best product for the customer, in which case you hesitate to sell it because you want to make sure that you're actually creating value for the customer. And in return, you earn loyalty, you learn trust. You have so many advantages that many other organizations cannot really have. And so this very simple question, do I really create value for my customers, turns out to be very powerful because we're often tempted to take shortcuts or we're often tempted to sell things just because, everybody's thinking about the top line. Everybody has a budget to meet. But really thinking about the long-term interest and the long-term value of customers and employees for that matter is what sets the company up for long-term success.
Let's say you've worked on the strategy and you've created value, right? What's a good way to capture that value? Is sharing the value with your suppliers and with your employees sort of a more sustainable model versus holding it all for yourself? And if that's the case, how do you decide how much should you keep it for yourself and how much do you share it with your suppliers, for example? What's the mental model there?
Yeah, so some of the sharing comes from market dynamics, right? Comes from competition. If I'm your customer and I'm deciding, do I buy from you? Do I buy from someone else? Of course, what I will compare is which of the two vendors will give me more value. So I'm thinking about my willingness to pay for your product versus your price, and then compare that with the competition, my willingness to pay for that product versus their price. And whoever offers more value gets to have my business. So it's actually quite difficult for companies to claim all the value because if they claim all the value, unless you're a monopolist that has no competition whatsoever, no one will buy for you. And even for a monopolist, because once prices are really, really high, of course, your market share is going to shrink, and that is often not the optimal thing to do. So competition disciplines behavior in the sense that it makes companies share value with your customers. And then I think, to rephrase your question a little bit, should you share even more over and above what competitive levels of sharing would imply? And there's a couple of good reasons to do it. One is a longer-term relationship with the customer. One is the trust and the loyalty that you earn from a particular customer. Sometimes when customers are fans of a product or fans of a company, they engage in word-of-mouth marketing, and that, of course, we know is very popular. So there's lots of good reasons to be generous. And the same, by the way, is true for employees. Even if you're in a very strong negotiating position, say, the labor market is not working very well at a moment in time and unemployment is relatively high, you want to be very careful about using that moment to not share value with your employees. Because guess what? It comes to haunt you because you won't have the labor relations that you would like to have. So what's interesting about this observation that the most successful companies pursue value-based strategies is that you would think, well, shouldn't there be like smart ways to capture a lot of value from your customer and that would also make you successful? And the difference is when you create value for your customers and then you share it, that's win-win. There's no pushback. Say, if I have a very sophisticated price discrimination scheme, like think of an airplane completely full, every person in every seat will have paid a slightly different price, depending on when you bought the ticket and your browser and so on and so on. How much value does that price discrimination create? Nothing for the passengers, right? It's all just for the company. And so if you try to be more successful by essentially keeping all the value to yourself, price discrimination is just one of many ways to do this, you get natural pushback. If you try to capture all the value in supplier relationships, suppliers will push back and say, no, actually, we want a better margin. And so in the end, I see in the data that companies that just try to capture value without creating it, they're not among the most successful because there's always this natural pushback. Customers will push back or suppliers will push back. If you start with extra value creation to begin with, there's no pushback because you did something amazing for me. And as a result, I'm happy to share the benefits.
Yeah. The airplane example is a very fascinating example for me.
Yes, they did such a good job. I mean, it's not like you shouldn't be naive. It is a way to increase the profitability of your company. The only question is, how far will it go? Can you really get to be a leading organization?
Yeah.
If in fact you say, well, let's try to mostly capture value, not worry so much about creating it in the first place. And I think that the answer in the data is pretty clear. No, you cannot.
Yeah. Complements and substitutes, right? The example of, let's say, New York Times, the newspaper versus the website.
Yes.
Is the website a complement to the newspaper, or is it actually a substitute? A lot of these things are much clearer when the boat has sailed through. So in hindsight,
That's right.
a lot of these things are much clearer. Are there some mental models that companies can use to maybe actively think about the whole concept of complements and substitutes?
Yeah. So there's two regularities I think that you want to keep in mind. When new technology comes along, in particular now digital technology, your first intuition is often going to be, oh my God, this will undermine my business. Because humans are programmed to very strongly respond to threats. And as a result, we see threats everywhere, even where they don't exist. The business history is riddled with examples where companies thought that something was a substitute, and then in fact it turned out to be a complement. The radio is a great example, right? When the radio first comes along, the music industry basically goes into panic, and it's completely understandable why. I'm making money selling records, and now someone invented this little box that plays music for free. And then, of course, later we discover, no, actually, the little box is really useful because it's a way to advertise music. So the first thing to know is, whenever you look at blockchain, you look at cryptocurrencies, you look at electronic cigarettes, whatever we look at that is really new, our first intuition is to jump to the conclusion that they're substitutes. And we're often not quite right. The second, I think, regularity that you see in the data is that even if substitution exists in the long run, we see it coming much faster than it actually does. The paperless office is maybe my favorite example. So when personal computers first came along, people predicted that there would be a paperless office. And then everybody gets a computer, and guess what? The demand for paper explodes because everybody likes printing like there's no tomorrow. Now, 50 years after the invention of the personal computer, it does look like we're actually in a situation where there's less demand because we're doing so many things online. Your generation, interestingly, is now completely comfortable not printing. My generation, oh my God, we're printing everything we possibly can. But your generation is, so the prediction was true. Computing online activity was a substitute for paper, but it took 50 years to come along. And that's the other regularity. Even if in fact substitution seems likely, it often happens much less quickly than you anticipate.
In my personal experience, when I look at the value stick, right, it seems that a lot of companies focus a lot more on the WTP side of things, willingness to pay, because that's where I think the general perception is that's where it's easier to create value versus the lower end of the stick, right? WTS, and focusing a lot more on employees. Why do you think that's the case, and what kind of mindset should companies be focusing on when they talk about WTS side of things?
So it's such a great observation. I think you're exactly right. For some reason, we seem to think that a particular job is a particular job is a particular job. Like when you ask people, how does your company compete for talent in the marketplace? I hear the most common answer by far is we're trying to be generous with compensation. And of course, there's two problems with that. If you can of course attract people by paying really, generous salaries, but you're giving value away. It's not creating any value. It's just shifting value from the company to the employees. But also you're missing out on an opportunity to actually lower willingness to sell and do it in a way that would attract a very specific group of workers. So I'll give you two examples that come to mind. Baycare is a hospital group in Florida, and they're nationwide renowned for the quality of their training programs. And so, of course, having great training programs is good because your nurses, your doctors, they will be more qualified to do better work. But maybe even more importantly, guess who wants to work at Baycare? Exactly the kind of people who are interested in lifelong learning. And so if you create better jobs by lowering willingness to sell, you get two things. You get financial flexibility. So you don't have to pay top of the market in order to attract talent, but also you get the people who are naturally interested in working for your organization. Uber has twice as many women drivers as a regular taxi company. How did they do it? Imagine that. Like we just doubled the size of the pool of people who want to work for Uber. How did we do it? Oh, very simple. Safety, because we know who the passenger is. It feels like a safer work environment. And then women are attracted to that work environment as opposed to working for a taxi company. So you want to think about the opportunities to create value for employees are at least as important. And I would argue in services are actually more important than value for customers. And the reason is in services, where does good service come from? It comes from the people you have in your organization. Yeah. And so the idea that you can sort of, not be really creative about how to create better jobs and still have amazing service, it's not a reasonable expectation to have. And in fact, the data show that most companies cannot do it.
Yeah. I this reminds me of the great example from Gap in the book, right? Around
yes.
The time app that they used.
That's exactly right. So they thought about an issue that many employers in the retail sector don't care about, and that is that retail workers typically don't know far in advance when they're going to work. Sometimes they have more shifts, sometimes they have fewer shifts. They learn about a week in advance, and as a result, it's almost impossible to plan your life. And then even worse, because you never really know how much work you're going to get. Your income is going to shift up and down. And so the Gap created this really the simplest of marketplaces where people could trade shifts. Oh, my daughter has fallen ill. I can't go to work. I can't go to work today. Let me offer my shift. Maybe someone else is happy to take an extra shift. And so they had tens of thousands of shifts that were traded. The company could take back shifts that people didn't want without hurting anyone's income. And then you look at the business results and they're just amazing. First thing is you see that labor productivity shoots up. So people are much more productive because when they are at work, they actually want to be at work. Second, same store sales increase by more than 10%. And then maybe most important, people are just much less stressed about work. In fact, parents in particular report that they sleep better because they know they live in a work environment that gives them more predictability and more flexibility at one and the same time. And so it's a good example, as you point out, in the sense that it's solving a real issue for the people in this particular sector. When we think about what's a better job, we often think very narrowly. Could we improve the process? Could we somehow maybe train people better? Things like this. But work is so much more, right? Work is, how do you need to get dressed? Work is, are you getting stuck in traffic? Work is, will my boss yell at me if I make a mistake? And so on. Work is really like so many different things. And on each of these dimensions, you can do a better job.
Yeah.
You can drive down willingness to sell. And all you need to figure out is what are these dimensions that are really important for your employees.
Before I let you go, I have one final question. For people who don't have wrinkles yet, how can they become better strategic thinkers? Where can people start, and what's the broader way of looking at things?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing is to really adopt this lens of value creation. So whenever you hear some idea, it doesn't really, you don't have to be the CEO. You don't have to be far up in the corporate hierarchy. For every idea that you have yourself, or every idea that others have, just ask, does it increase willingness to pay? Does it decrease willingness to sell? Then second question, ask, oh, who's going to be particularly attracted to that product, to that business, if I increase willingness to pay in a specific fashion, or if I decrease willingness to sell in a particular manner. And then the third question is, how expensive would it be to create even more value? And so you can be a strategic thinker irrespective of where you are in the organization. And in fact, if you progress in your career and at some point in time you have really big responsibility, it will have been so valuable for you to practice this for a very long time.
Yeah. Those were all the questions. Thank you so much for taking the time out, Felix. It was super insightful to speak to you.
My pleasure. It was nice to be with you.